in the series of our monthly educational events. This one will be on longitudinal training load management and how you can do that within Firstbeat Sports. So again, for in case anyone who's joining hasn't joined any of the previous sessions, I'll just quickly introduce myself. So I'm a sports scientist here at Firstbeat and have been here since 2017, so coming on for 9 years now. No, 8 years, bad maths. Prior to that, worked in Premier League at a couple of different teams. So yeah, my background is in soccer. So like a lot of the examples I give will be soccer based, but they're kind of transferable and can be applied to most contexts. So yeah, as mentioned, the purpose of today to look at longitudinal training load management, and more specifically, that's working around with the acute chronic workload ratio model, which essentially is gives you a picture into how much work your training load your athletes have done in the last week compared to what they've done historically. And I'll go through a bit of the history, where that model comes from, how it's calculated, what it can do and what it can't do, how some of the other metrics in Firstbeat kind of allow you to go a bit further beyond that, and yeah, then some of the practical tools within the platform and how they can be utilized in the context of monitoring your long-term training loads. So first of all, I think it's useful to understand a bit of the history of the models and where they come from. And like the first, the kind of the origins of the acute chronic model come from Bannister's fitness and freshness model, which I think was first appeared in around in the 1970s. So it's been around for a while. And the general kind of idea was that your fitness is your training load that you've built up over an extended period of time. And that equates in the more recent models to the chronic training load. Fatigue is then kind of what you've done within the last sort of 7 days. So that the more recent training load, and that again, that equates to the acute load in the current models. And then from that, you could sort of model your freshness or your form, as they were called in those early models. So taking one away from the other, which again, similar sort of context or idea to the ratio that's used in a lot of the team sport models now. As I've kind of got in the bullet point, so what you've done over a long period of time is what you've built up. So your training history is then like your fitness or your conditioning. And then you take away from that the more recent training load, which is going to be contributing to any fatigue that the athlete is experiencing theoretically, and that sort of acts as an indicator into where their form or performance levels might be. And then it's evolved, and there's several sort of evolutions of it. And if anyone is here that works in endurance sports, they're going to probably be familiar with the training stress balance model, which is much the same thing, the acute training load, the chronic training load, and then the balance between them, so the training stress balance. That was developed by Andrew Coggin, I think, more recently. And yeah, a couple of screenshots of them there, so you kind of see how they work and how they're often presented. And again, it look broadly similar to some of the acute chronic ratio stuff that you may well have seen in team sport more recent years. So yeah, like I said, the concepts have been quite extensively used in endurance sport for quite a long time, and it's used primarily in that context for planning and modeling like training loads over time. Tend to use longer term plans, particularly when individuals may be only aiming to peak for 1 or 2 events a year, rather than team sports where you're essentially looking to peak every week for 9 or 10 months of the year potentially. And these kind of concepts became more popular in team sport probably around 10 or 12 years ago, when some of the earlier publications from Tim Gabbett came about. So you may well have seen the chart that's shown on the right, kind of which depicts the sweet spot and the danger zones as they were termed. And that was from 2016, I believe. Yeah, 2016. So moving on from like the brief historical introduction. So what are the acute and chronic loads? How are they calculated? So as I've said, the acute load is the most recent training load, and that typically uses 7-day training load value. Some models might use slightly different values, but most commonly it's 7 days. And then the chronic load, again, very commonly uses the most recent 28 days of training, but there are some models that may use up to 6 weeks or even more. Kind of depends on what the coach's philosophies are, but yeah, certainly in team sport, again, 28 days is most common. Endurance sport, 6 weeks is probably a bit more common, but yeah, there's kind of no right or wrong as such, but they're the typical values that are used. And then the acute to chronic workload ratio, which essentially tells you how quickly your training load is changing, either up or down, is simply calculated by dividing the two, basically dividing the acute load by the chronic load, and then that gives you the value, the acute to chronic workload ratio. There's numerous other variances on the models. So you've got the rolling average model, the exponentially weighted moving average, and then you have coupled and uncoupled. And I'll explain those a little bit in the subsequent slides in a moment. But in Firstbeat Sports, our calculations are based on the rolling average model and the coupled model. So yeah, that's what you would see presented within any of the Firstbeat Sports data. So first kind of potential variance that you have is the rolling average and the exponentially weighted models. So the rolling average is probably a more simple calculation. For the acute load, it is the most recent 7 days totaled up. So the TRIMP total, in our case, taken from the most recent 7 days. And then the chronic load is calculated based upon the average 7-day value over the past 28 days. So your average weekly training load over the last 4 weeks. I've put in there 42 days or 6 weeks as well, because like I said, they're often used, albeit not in our model or not in our platform. And then you have the exponentially weighted rolling average model, which yeah, provides a greater weighting on more recent sessions, but continues to factor in historical sessions for longer. And I've put the calculations on the right. That's just taken as a quote from Murray's study. It's not as complicated as it looks, actually. It's relatively simple. Basically, it takes today's training load, or today's training load equals the value that you were on yesterday, times by the decay factor, and then yesterday's training load values. So yeah, it looks complex there because it's using a few kind of mathematical symbols, but it's actually, when you can put it into Excel or something quite easily, and it's a relatively straightforward calculation. Yeah, so like I said, one of the reasons people may favor that is because it doesn't just discard historical training when you move past the period that it's within, whereas the rolling average model, if something then becomes 29 days ago, that's no longer included within the totals. So that's one advantage of the exponentially weighted model, whereas the rolling average is probably slightly, like I said, easier to calculate, but also then gives you real values. So when you're planning your training over the next few days, you're utilizing real values. So if you want to see how 100 TRIMP affects the values in 2 days' time, you can calculate that, whereas the exponentially weighted doesn't use real values as such, so it's a bit harder to kind of use it for planning. And then just an example of the rolling average calculation. So if your last 4 weekly TRIMP totals are as shown, and that's your 28-day TRIMP total, you then divide that by 4, and that gives you your current chronic load value. So again, like a super easy, simple calculation, and that's part of the benefit of that model as well. It's just it's much easier. And then the other variance that you have that might not be quite so aware of is the coupled versus uncoupled. And like I said, we use coupled model in Firstbeat Sports, and that's the more common, I think. But it's worth kind of explaining the difference between the two. So within the coupled model, the chronic load is based upon the whole of the 28-day history, kind of as depicted there. Whereas in the uncoupled, it's actually separate from the acute load. So you'll have the preceding 21 days as your chronic load, and then just the last 7 days will only contribute to the acute. Some studies kind of said like it's better to separate them out because then the acute load isn't influencing the chronic load, whereas if you use the coupled model, it is. But again, it's kind of personal preference to an extent. And yeah, whatever kind of you find easiest to calculate and easiest to work with, really. So there's, again, like with all of these, what's right for one person won't necessarily be right for another. Yeah, so then moving on, so we kind of got to think what is the acute chronic workload ratio and what isn't it. So when it first kind of really came to prominence, like I said, 10 to 12 years ago, there was a lot of hype around it. Like, can it be used for predicting injury? And a lot of the stuff, yeah, like the early studies showed, yes, it does have a link with injury. But yeah, the reality is that probably isn't the case. So more contemporary research or subsequent research has shown that perhaps the two actually don't marry up that well. And I think the way they were calculated might kind of give a bit of insight into that. So the studies used what's called an odds ratio. So basically looked at what are the odds of injury in certain circumstances against other circumstances. And while the individuals or those with higher acute chronic ratios did show in these studies that there was higher risk of injury above a certain threshold, the reality was the occurrences were still very low. So you might get 3 cases out of 100 that presented as injury. So it's still really difficult to actually predict injuries from that kind of value. And on that note, I realise I've perhaps not explained the acute chronic ratio properly. So just going sort of backtracking a little bit, the acute chronic workload ratio, like I said, is the acute load divided by the chronic load. And essentially the thought process behind that is if it goes above 1.5, roughly, that suggests that the training load is perhaps increasing too quickly because you're in the last week, you've done more than your athletes are prepared for. And similarly, if it goes below 0.8, that might suggest that they're being deloaded too quickly. So the higher the ratio is, the theory being that, yeah, loads are increasing too quickly and increasing injury risk. So yeah, so with that in mind, like I said, it was thought that a high acute chronic ratio would be a predictor of injury, when the reality is it perhaps isn't. And likewise, it doesn't necessarily predict performance either. So it is a guide as to how quickly your training loads are changing over time, rather than sort of a direct marker of whether someone is going to perform well or whether someone's going to get injured. But it's still useful in practical terms because it kind of gives you that model. It allows you to visualize how your training loads are changing over time. Are they high? Are they low? And that kind of thing. So you've still got that. It is still a useful tool, but perhaps not quite so clear cut in whether it can predict an injury or not. So then in terms of utilizing it within Firstbeat, so acute chronic workload ratio is kind of one part of the equation of maintaining or monitoring your long-term training load. So that's where our training status metric then comes in, which also includes the recovery data for the last 14 days. And what that then attempts to do is it shows it is the athlete's recovery kind of in balance with the training loads that they're being subjected to. So if someone's got particularly high training load or is perhaps experiencing slightly quicker increases in training load than might be ideal, that's not necessarily a problem, particularly if their recovery data is good, and that then indicates that they're still kind of managing that training load and they're still coping with it. And likewise, the training load indicators might show that it should theoretically be fine, but if that athlete actually isn't recovering very well, then that could still be an important indicator to suggest that maybe they're not coping that well with their training. So kind of adds that extra layer to the analysis, and yeah, gives you again, makes it easier to interpret what's happening, because you've got that extra variable and that extra sort of those extra bits of data taken into account when kind of assessing the long-term training. But with that in mind, it's kind of important that we maintain the loads as accurately as we can. And that in the real world, that can obviously be challenging, particularly if your like local competitions don't allow you to wear monitoring equipment within games, for example. Or yeah, sessions get missed. It happens in the real world. Someone loses their sensor, someone forgets to wear it, something like that, and then you need to be able to input a value for that session to kind of maintain those long-term loads as accurately as you can. And that's where the maximal manual exercise input tool comes into play. So it allows you to, as the name suggests, manually insert a training load value for a session or a game or whatever it is that you need to, whatever hole you need to plug. And they've got at the bottom on the left-hand side just an example of why that is quite important. So if the left example, the two values shown in bold at either end of the sequence of numbers of your hypothetical games, and then the values shown on the right are what it would look like if those values weren't input. And you can see that the acute loads and the chronic loads and also the ratio values are quite different if you weren't able to include that game data. So that sort of highlights the importance and the value of doing that. Likewise, if normal training sessions, if there's something missing, again, it kind of highlights why you need to do your best to kind of include that values if you can. And then this slide is kind of going back to what we did in the first, or what some of the stuff we covered in the first session. So if you missed that, you can obviously find the recordings, which was looking at kind of how to establish game values and utilize those within your training, and this was one part of that. So yeah, the obvious way to kind of find out what our game values are is to collect some games. That could be pre-season or practice games if you can't use it in real official competition. But also if you can't do that, then you can contact us, utilize our big data. We kind of have an idea of roughly what match play looks like across our main sports. So the example there of a soccer match would suggest for someone who's played a full game that their trim values would be around 2.7 per minute, which equates to I think about 240 over 90 minutes. So if you've not been able to collect real game data, then you can still get a reasonably good estimate as to what to insert as a game value. I think you might get, or some might think, well, if we never input game data, then that's fine, like because we're always judging like for like. But then the kind of thing to consider that is every single week exactly the same? So that would mean that pre-season follows the same kind of microcycle schedules as in season, for example, and do your games always fall on exactly the same day? Because if your games move within the week, you might have 2 games in 1 week, especially common in soccer. You have some weeks where you might play 3 times within the space of 8 or 9 days, and then other times where you might only play once. If you're then not inputting that game data into those circumstances, then it's kind of becoming difficult to compare week on week. And likewise, if a player comes into the starting lineup, out of the starting lineup, then your weeks are kind of they're different, and so the data isn't directly comparable. So I would strongly recommend trying to input manually anything that might be missing, because I think it really does mean the long-term loads are that much more accurate, and give you a better picture to base your decisions on, and hopefully make it a bit more reliable for you as well, and make those decisions a bit more informed. Then kind of moving on to the last point that we'll cover. So within the platform as well, we have our weekly summary reporting. So you can see a long-term picture within like the cloud dashboard as well, but the weekly reporting again just makes it a bit clearer, a bit easier to track. It gives you a snapshot of the last 12 weeks, so you can see how your acute loads have progressed, which is the black line shown in the charts, where your game days were. So you can see that what weeks have been quite game heavy, that game maybe more demanding on the athletes. And then you have the balanced range, which is essentially, or which is based upon the chronic load, and then with a buffer either side, so based on the acute to chronic workload ratio research. So it's the grey band is between 0.8 and 1.3 of the chronic load. So it's just a slightly different way of visualizing it, and I think it makes it probably a bit easier to read than seeing kind of two solid lines across the whole chart. And then lastly, you're also seeing the trim values at the bottom, so you can kind of see how each of those weeks were structured. And then last of all, you've also got the 7-day average of the quick recovery data, so you can again see how well your athletes are recovering, how they're coping with their training loads. Do they need to, have their loads monitored? Are they doing fine? Can they potentially be pushed a bit more on that side of it? So it just makes it super easy to go through, compare everyone, see how everyone's doing, and then allows you to dive deeper if there's kind of any outliers within that, within your group. So then just in summary, so kind of just introduced the the acute to chronic workload ratio model, where it came from, and a brief history of it, the different variances in that model and what we use in Firstbeat. So as already stated, we use the rolling average model, and it's the coupled version. Covered lit, it's kind of a tool for load progression, load management, but probably not going to be predicting injury or performance. Like I said, there was that hope that maybe it would be an injury predictor, but the reality is just because someone who's got a high acute chronic load, a high acute chronic ratio in 1 week, their risk of injury might be 5 times that someone who is within the kind of the sweet spot, but the number of occurrences of injury is still pretty low. So it might be a case of 1 in 100 versus 3 in 100. And then by utilizing training status, you kind of get a bit more context within the training load numbers, because it's adding in the recovery data. Then it's important to maintain the values as accurately as you can using the manual exercise. And then lastly, the weekly summary report, which we introduced, just gives you that some clearer depiction, makes it easy to just compare and look through your whole group without and kind of screen for those outliers within it. Here's a couple of useful links. So just a couple of bits just to cover, so you can read in a bit more detail on some of the elements we've discussed, or if you want to have a look at how to use the weekly reporting, I've put the address there for the video that shows that, and just some of the help articles that show you how to use some of the different features. And that is everything for today. So we've got the next session in a month's time, and that will be about using heart rate variability and recovery data. We don't, or do we have any questions? So there's none been written so far. So we're at 3:26. I'll maybe hang on for 2 minutes in case anyone has any questions. But if we don't, then we will finish in about a minute's time. And obviously, if if no one has any questions here, but at the moment, but if you do think of anything that you would like to know, or anything I can clarify or provide more information on, then my email address is on the bottom left of the slides. You're more than welcome to email, or you can also use customer care at firstbeat.com, and that will come through to the sports customer support team as well. So feel free to use either of those email addresses to kind of send in any questions if they come to you after the session. Doesn't look like we've got any more. So we'll finish there. Thank you for joining. I hope it was helpful for you, and hopefully we'll see you in a month's time.